Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and something that I noticed is that there is a lot of discussion and criticism towards Western animation productions for TV. And one of the most common criticisms that I see is the poor animation quality within these Western productions. And from my perspective, I do think that the criticism is valid. As someone who's worked on these shows as a pre-production artist or storyboard artist, sometimes the material we get back isn't exactly how we imagined it would turn out. And it sometimes leaves us wondering if it was something that we did wrong in our production. But I also learned to realize that there are a lot of factors that are way out of my control. Now, with that being said, this has led to a lot of discourse within social media. And what I see a lot are people who don't really have any animation experience talk about as if they know why the animation quality suffers. I think one of the most common and easiest answers that you see a lot online is it's just an overall budget issue. As if throwing a lot of money will make the animation quality just suddenly become really good. But as someone who's been in these environments and had to do a bit of animation supervision work for an indie project that had to work with a vendor studio overseas, there's a lot more issues than just mere budget. So first of all, let's talk about the executive decision or the lead decision. I think this is where they decide the budget, the resources being used, what studio they go with, what the schedule is like, and basically setting up different priorities. Now, I've been in projects where the executive decisions being made, or the people that are completely fully in charge with how to move forward with a project, a lot of them do not really have animation knowledge or understand the process. The thing with animation is that there's a lot of steps required and it does take time. And once you finish one step or one stage, you move on to the next, praying that you don't have to redo the previous stages due to some small notes. And that happens a lot. Like when the animation's fully done, some person on top will say, I don't like the way this character looks in this angle. Can we completely redo this? And then it gets redone and they keep changing their minds. So, things like that just hinders the overall flow. I'm someone who enjoys a lot of playful animation, like when characters deform, to really feel that motion and that squash and stretch, when characters exaggerate drawings just to push an emotion. I love that stuff, but I've worked with people on top who just want the character to be strictly on model. And if it deforms one bit, they see it as bad animation, low quality. I think the biggest issue is that sometimes these guys change their minds all the time in what they want. They keep asking for retakes and redos to the point that you don't know what they're trying to achieve. And of course, that will burn out an animation team, it'll cause bottlenecking, and it depletes resources. The next contributing factor that I want to talk about is, of course, budget, because this is something that gets thrown a lot in animation quality discussions. And it does play a huge role, because with budget, the way to look at it is you're reserving someone's service and time. And with animation studios, there's of course a lot of bidding, because not only are some of these studios highly demanded for their quality of work, as well as providing actual service, but also their time. They may be fully booked for another production. I remember being in a discussion for which animation studio we would move forward with. We wanted one, but they couldn't take it because they were already fully booked. Now, another thing that budget does is that it allows you to retain the manpower or the artists that you want for the project. Because artists are constantly moving, they're constantly finding newer gigs. So in a way, that budget is for animation studios so they can retain their artists. And yes, of course, manpower. But at the end of the day, regardless of the budget, the quality can be heavily compromised by my next point. Let's talk about scheduling. So I'm referring to deadlines or delivery. Like I said before, animation does take a lot of time. And a lot of people seem to think that, if you just give them a pretty good budget and a deadline, they're just going to do good work, right? Well, from my experience working within productions, imagine if you had to keep redoing stuff over and over again, only for the time to shrink and the deadline not changing. So, of course, artists are going to get burned out. The budget is forced to work with the retakes. Or another opposite issue is that the project just keeps getting delayed and delayed to the point where the vendor studio or the animation studio can't retain their artists for the project. So they have to bring on last minute people who don't really know the production that well, and they might be turning in bad quality. I was working on a project where it just kept getting delayed nonstop to the point where every time they gave notes back to the animation studio, it would be a different staff handling that retake. So it's not the same people that dealt with the previous feedback. It's new people trying to figure out what the retake is all about. So I really do think that schedule plays a huge role in animation quality because you want to give the artists in the animation studio time to do their best work without being bottlenecked to hell, but also be very decisive on when they should wrap up, so they know how to cast their artists. Okay, the next one I do want to talk about is the production and overall pipeline, because I feel like for the past 10 years, it's changed so much. And I'm going to just talk about the Western animation pipeline. In most of them, you get their main studio and then you get a vendor studio. The main studio, so an example is like, let's say Disney TV, they do their pre-production stuff, character designs, viz dev, storyboards, animatics, and then they send it off to an animation service studio or a vendor studio. And they animate the shots, they provide the final animation, and they send it back for post. So one of the challenges with that is that everything is not done under the same roof. Whereas with some studios where everything is done in the same roof or in the same building, it's easier to sort of track quality. Another issue we face too is that they've been removing certain departments or certain steps. An example of this is the layout. And the layout is a good bridge between storyboards or animatics to animation. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the studios in America, they do not have an in-house animation team, which I think is good to have because you're much closer to getting close to what the client wants. So I do think that because of the segregation of different departments, the removal of certain steps, and how everything is done with so many different companies or different studios or subcontractors, it's kind of hard to sort of track the quality of things. Oh, another thing that I do want to bring up when there's just a lot of different departments, especially when it comes to overseas studios, is that sometimes not everyone's getting the same thing. So an example of this is an animatic is done, right? But the animators do not have access to that animatic. They're given a printout of their shot and what happens in that shot, a description of that. Happens when some of the animation studios still use paper. They're just given a contact sheet or a traditional storyboard from the animatic. So not everyone's on the same page. Not everyone is communicated the same way or given the same material. And stuff like that will often lead to things like miscommunication. And if you're dealing with overseas studios, there's going to be language barriers. Now, when it comes to the production too, you can be severely understaffed. So I remember helping on one production where it felt like I was juggling not just storyboards, but also animation retakes, animation notes, character design notes, and I feel like you need dedicated people who are the go-to people for each of those departments. Now, the next contributing factor that I do want to talk about is communication. So, like I said, in a lot of Western animation productions, we use vendor studios from overseas. So these are animation studios based in Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, China, India, Thailand, with some of these countries not having English as a dominant language. So there's going to be some language barriers and definitely some mistranslations, especially when it comes to retakes and notes. Now, besides that, another communication issue that I faced when I was supervising an animation production was breaking down the notes that my clients or my supervisors were giving me. Like I said, some of these leaders are not familiar with animation or don't really know how to give animation notes or feedback. Like sometimes my producer or the client will look at the animation and say, oh, it looks janky, it looks glitchy, or it looks wrong, or it doesn't look good. And these notes are not helpful at all. And so basically my job was to sort of see what they were responding to and how do I make it more specific that an animation studio or an animator can actually address. What helps is clear communication or more specific notes. And another thing that can help, especially with animation retakes, are things like jaw overs or animation retakes done on top of the original animation so they can see the difference. I think something that helped with a vendor studio that I was working with was to have a separate document that has a shot list and all the notes written down in more specific manner. And what could make the animation quality good is that you actually have an animation person do animation notes, a character design person do drawing and character design notes, just so that quality remains consistent. Now, I think the last one I want to talk about is the animator or the studio skill. How skilled or how experienced are they? So, like I said earlier, a lot of animation in America, especially for TV shows, the animation is done through an outsourced company. And in countries like Korea, there's a lot of studios that provide service animation work for different bigger studios. They're going to give you a fair price and they're going to deliver the work. And that's something that a lot of clients will gear towards. They just want professionalism. And when you work with a studio that does a lot of service work for American productions, they turn in work timely. They've been using a system that has worked for decades, and they'll turn in the appropriate materials for deliverables. These are things like assets, work files, project files, and they're all organized pretty nicely. And that's what I mean by the professionalism. But let's say you want this project to be very sakuga, very action, and very beautifully drawn and dynamic. You could go for an outsourced studio that does like Family Guy or Nickelodeon. Probably not the right fit. They'll try to do it, but it might not be what you're looking for. So it's probably better to go for a studio that is best for those roles. Like an example is Studio Mir. So when you're looking at animation teams, it's kind of like casting. And another thing that I do want to bring up is when you're working with an animation provider or a service studio, you're not really sure who they're putting on board for the project. You may get an A tier team, you may get a B tier team. And that's something that people do recognize. I personally don't think it's a studio's responsibility to disclose that, unless they put you in a situation where working with certain people or working with certain countries might be considered treason. Also, another thing that we've been seeing less and less within the pre-production stage or the early stages of an animated TV show are wedge tests with different studios. So a wedge test is when an animation studio performing the animation service fully animates a few shots from the animatics or storyboards. And usually the major studio would send these out to different overseas animation studios to see which studio best fits their vision, or which one best performs. Now, we're seeing this step less and less because of scheduling and budget. And there has been cases where an overseas studios that did a wedge test was approved and selected to be the animation studio for the show, only to turn it down because they just did the wedge test just for the money and were already not available or had no intentions to be the service animation for the show. So we're seeing shows avoid this process entirely and just moving forward with a studio that has experience and a studio that's just available. And you won't know if they're the right fit or not until later on. And of course, some animation studios used multiple studios. When I was on Invincible, one studio would tackle a set number of episodes, and another studio would handle the other episodes remaining. And in some cases, one studio would be way more experienced than the other, and you could see those inconsistencies, or the shift in quality. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about because every time I go online, especially on a really bad place like Twitter, which is a terrible place for artists and animators, a lot of people like to blame the artists and the animators involved in those projects because it's easy just to associate that. And as someone who's worked on some of these productions, a lot of the artists and animators had a lot of things working against them, whether it's a bad leadership or low budget or questionable decisions made by the client. It's going to be mostly the artists and their skills being blamed for that. And like I said earlier, I think the criticism is fair when they do talk about why the quality looks weird. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of factors like the budget, there's decisions made by leadership about retakes and all that, the really tight schedule, and the constant bottlenecking of a schedule. And if I haven't explained the issue with the bottleneck, it's when you're given a deadline and when you're getting closer to that deadline, you're asked to redo stuff, you're asked to do retakes, and the deadline doesn't change. So you're getting very little time to even achieve those notes. So yeah, very easy to blame the animators because what you see on the screen is a result of their work, but there's a lot of gears in the machine. That's all I want to say. Bye.
Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.